Now it's time to turn our attention to Percy Bysshe Shelley. And we're going to start by looking at his defense of poetry, which is an essential document to understand Romanticism and the way the Romantic poets themselves saw the function of their poetry and literature. Because he's making a spirited defense of poetry as something that benefits society, he puts in one place a clear definition of what the Romantic poets saw as the essential function of poetry in society. Now, Shelley's defense of poetry is written in defense against charges that were brought in a satirical essay by one of Shelley's friends, Thomas Love Peacock, in an essay called The Four Ages of Poetry. And Peacock himself was writing a satire. He didn't believe the arguments that he was making against poetry, but nevertheless he was satiring a very real position. And that is a position that was espoused by a group of people led by Jeremy Bentham. And we'll see that in much more detail later when we look at John Stuart Mill's autobiography and his discussion of Bentham's theories and beliefs about poetry. In order to understand why Shelley finds it necessary to defend poetry, we need to look in more detail at Jeremy Bentham and his followers and what they believed. Bentham is important not only to understand Shelley and Shelley's defense, but essential to understand the 19th century, because Bentham was the leader of a group of people who called themselves the Philosophical Radicals and who espoused a doctrine of morality called utilitarianism, which represents one half of the fundamental philosophical divide in 19th century society, which is represented throughout its literature. And we will see it in Charles Dickens and Thomas Carlyle, and also popping up in different ways in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre and in other novels we won't read like Villette. So understanding Bentham becomes essential to understanding 19th century society and its literature. The 19th century was a period of tremendous social debate and public discussion. Everything was debated. At the time, journalism was in its heyday, and there were a new range of publications ranging from daily newspapers to critical reviews, including prominent reviews like Blackwood's or the Westminster Review, which was founded by John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham. The debates covered all sorts of social topics, issues of public interest, which were described as questions. There was the woman question, the condition of England question, the slavery question. Slavery still existed in some of England's colonies at the time. Debates about the value of the empire. So the 19th century was filled with these debates. One of the most important debates of the 19th century that underlay and informed many of the other debates taking place at the time was a debate between two groups of people. One group who accepted the received ideology from the past, and another group who were developing a new ideology in response to the changing social conditions of British empiricism and rationalism and the Industrial Revolution. On one side were a group of people who have come to be called the Transcendentalist, people who believed in a transcendent order and that the world was supposed to respond to or reflect this order in some way. And those included the Romantic poets. Keats and Shelley are obvious examples, Wordsworth to another extent, Blake as well. And then Thomas Carlyle, who, as we pointed out earlier, was born in 1795 and had he died young would have been considered a Romantic, and Thomas Carlyle's follower Charles Dickens, who dedicated to Thomas Carlyle his novel Hard Times, which was an attack on the utilitarian beliefs of the other group. And the other group, of course, therefore, were the utilitarians. And the utilitarians included Jeremy Bentham, James Mill, and from our class, John Stuart Mill, whom we will be reading in the future. Jeremy Bentham was an essential figure. He was born in the middle of the 1800s and died in 1832, which is an extremely important date for a number of reasons in Victorian society, not the least of which is that it's the date that we use to begin the Victorian period and the date of the passage of the first Reform Bill. But he was a philosopher and social reformer whose writings and theories were behind many of the major reforms to English society at the time, including the reforms to social institutions, including the legal profession and the law, and also changes in ethics and debates about ethics that would reach all the way well into the 20th century and still go on today. He also was responsible for many of the new theories in economics, which followed from the writings of Adam Smith, whom we looked at the beginning of the semester. And he was most prominent in his writings about political philosophy. He also influenced some of the most important writers and thinkers of the 19th century, including James Mill and his very prominent and influential son, John Stuart Mill. And then, of course, he was the founder of utilitarianism. The utilitarians were a group, a self-identified group. They regarded themselves as a group and called themselves the philosophical radicals, and were often referred to by their enemies primarily as Benthamites. In order to understand the doctrine of utilitarianism, we first have to understand the concept of utility as the basis of a moral philosophy. And it's easiest to do that by opposing it to its normal opposite, which is transcendental standards based upon absolute values. So transcendental standards of moral behavior are based upon rules that are handed down by a supreme deity, like the Ten Commandments, or originate in nature, concepts of natural law. One conforms with these standards either because God said so, or because it is an essential rule of our nature. But in both cases, the source of these rules is transcendental. It comes from beyond the human realm. So, for example, the fifth commandment in Christianity, thou shalt not kill, in a transcendental moral situation, one does not kill, not because it harms people or causes sadness, but simply because God said don't kill. That would be a transcendental rule. On the other hand, utility is based upon empirical values, on the observation of human behavior and on their effects. So a standard based upon utility judges acts by their effects, not by their conformity to a pre-established transcendental rule. It's important to distinguish the general concept of utility from the doctrine of utilitarianism. The general concept of utility as a moral standard judges any act based upon its effects. For convenience's sake, let's call this utility with a small u. Utility with a small u is any doctrine that judges an act or behavior based upon its effects, whatever those effects may be. So if you construct a moral philosophy that judges acts based upon whether or not they create a large number of hot fudge sundaes, that would be utility with a small u. The philosophical doctrine of utilitarianism, however, considers a much more specific effect. They evaluate acts as good or bad depending upon whether or not they promote happiness. So any act that contributes to the happiness of humans is a good act, and any act that limits the happiness of humans or causes unhappiness is a bad act. And that is known as the greatest happiness principle, which John Stuart Mill will discuss in detail in his pamphlet Utilitarianism that we'll be looking at briefly later in the semester. So the greatest happiness principle is acts are good that contribute to the greatest happiness of the greatest number, and acts are bad as they cause unhappiness or limit people's happiness. So that finally brings us to the question of, why is this a problem for Shelley? Why would Shelley and Shelley's friend Thomas Love Peacock take on this concept of utilitarianism? And the reason is quite simple. Jeremy Bentham once famously dismissed poetry as equivalent to pushpin. Pushpin is a silly little game like Twiddlywinks that kids play. So, according to the traditional utilitarian doctrine, poetry was basically a waste of time. It was useless. It didn't contribute to public happiness in any way. Jeremy Bentham was famously dismissive of anything that constituted play or was related in any way to the imagination, which is one of the conceptions of utilitarianism that Charles Dickens will attack in Hard Times. So Shelley is reacting to the utilitarian dismissal of the imagination as an essential power, favoring fact and reason over the imagination. And that's where the defense will begin, by describing what the concepts of reason and the imagination are and what they do.